Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our Pep Talk, pre-Thanksgiving Pep Talk. My name is David Feeks. I'm the owner of the Parents Estate Planning Law Firm in Acton. Glad that you could join me this morning. We'll spend about 15 or 20 minutes here talking about talking about how to talk to your parents or how to talk to your family about estate planning. Our Pep Talks, we bring these out once a month to talk about estate planning topics or topics of interest to you in an easier, lighter way, in a quicker way, so that you don't have to spend a lot of time learning about the things that you should know or the things that would be important to you. So this morning, because Thanksgiving is coming up in just a little over a week, and everybody's getting ready to sit down at the table with their family, and everybody needs things to talk about at the Thanksgiving table that might not be politics. So we've got to avoid politics. What else can we talk about? So I think one of the great things that you could talk about when you've got your family kind of all around the table, captive, maybe there's a little wine involved, is to talk about estate planning. Sometimes it's the easiest time to talk about estate planning. When I'm working with clients, one of the biggest questions or issues that I deal with clients once we've got their plan in place is, what do my parents have in place? And how this arises is that for a lot of our clients, when they are creating a plan that is designed to make things as easy as possible for their family, for their kids, for their guardians, for the people who are going to manage money for their kids if their kids are still young. Once our clients have that in place, the next thing almost all of them start to think about is, what am I going to have to deal with when something happens to my parents? Or what are me and my siblings going to have to deal with when something happens to my parents? And most often, our clients don't know the answer to that. And so I always encourage clients to start a conversation with their parents, with their family, about what's going to happen. You know, we have a saying in our office that talking about estate planning won't kill you. It won't. It will be better for you. It will be better for your parents. And I learned another saying recently that I thought was very, very funny, and it's not mine, but I'm going to pass it along to you. And this is particularly relates to Thanksgiving dinner, and that is, there's no pie until we talk about what will happen when you die. So if you want to use that with your parents, the pie's not showing up until we talk about what happens when you die. So Thanksgiving, let's think about it for a second. We've got a table, we've got everybody around the table. Everybody is sitting in one place. Generally, we're sitting in some kind of circle, or we're sitting around something. And as I said before, sometimes there's wine involved. So it makes it easier to have this conversation, because usually all the players are in one place. So we don't have to start the conversation with one person and try to continue the conversation with another person. If you've got your parents there, if your siblings are there, perfect. We can get this all out on the table, as it were, at one time. So number one, why do you need to be having this conversation with your parents? As I said before, number one, because I think it's important for kids to know what's going to happen when their parents die. So this doesn't come as a surprise to you. So it doesn't come as a surprise to anyone. So you're not left floundering. So you're not left casting around. What are we supposed to do? What's in place? How are we going to figure everything out? It's important that you understand whether or not you're going to be left with a mess. And we'll talk about what a mess looks like in just a second, so that you can start to avoid that mess or take steps to make sure that it's not going to be as messy as it otherwise would be. So, you know, if your parents don't have a plan in place, or if they have an outdated plan in place, things could end up messy. If they don't have a plan in place, all their assets could end up in a probate court process. And in Massachusetts, that's a year-long, expensive, time-consuming, burdensome process that you may not want to be going through. You probably won't want to be going through. And more importantly, your parents may not have intended for you, or may not have wanted for you to go through either. But if there's no plan in place, that's what's going to happen kind of naturally and by default. And there's always ways to plan to avoid probate, but it does require planning and advanced thought and advanced decision making. The second reason why you want to have this conversation and to understand what's going on in your parents' plan is so that you can avoid family misunderstandings. Because your parents may, even if they've got a plan in place, they may have a very particular reason about why they're doing things. But if it's not clear to everybody why they're doing things, then after they're gone, there can be misunderstandings. And the problem with misunderstandings around estate planning is it's almost impossible to clear them up because the people who could clear them up are by definition not there anymore. So understanding what's in your parents' plan or what your parents' intentions are is important, and it's important for everybody to hear, everybody who's around the table to hear, so that there are no misunderstandings later. And the third reason why it's so important to talk to your parents, your family about estate planning is to understand your role in that plan if you have a role. If your parents have appointed you as a decision maker in their plan for them or later on, it's important for you to know that. If you're going to be the executor of their will, it's important for you to know that. If you're going to be the trustee of their trust, it's important for you to know that. If you're going to be their healthcare decision maker, it's important for you to know that. Number one, so that you can be prepared for that when the time comes. And number two, so that you can decide whether or not you want that role. You know, as I always say to clients that I'm working with, you need to have a conversation with everybody you're choosing to play a role in your plan, because they may not want that role. They may not be willing to accept that role. And so it's important for them to know ahead of time that they have that role so that they can make informed and intelligent decisions about, do I want to do this? And if I don't, so I can tell you that I don't want to have this role, and then somebody can make a better plan around that. So how do we start this conversation? I think if you've got your own plan in place, I think let me backtrack. If you've got your own plan in place, or even if you don't, the best place for you to start to have this conversation with your parents is to start with you. Mom, Dad, I just got my plan in place, or we just got our plan in place. And it got me thinking as we were making plans for what's going to happen for our kids, for our family, and how we were going to make that, and how we were learning about how to make that easier for them. It got me thinking about your plan and what is going to happen if something happens to you, and who's going to play a role in that plan, what's going to happen. And just, it would be helpful for me to understand what that looks like just in the big picture. You don't need the details, just the big picture, so that we can understand what's going to happen. You know, and as I always say to clients, feel free to blame your attorney for forcing that conversation, because as the people who are helping you plan, we need to know things like, or we want to know things like, are you going to be receiving an inheritance? How much? Is that going to have an impact on your plan? How are you going to receive that inheritance? Are you going to get it outright? Is it just going to come to you? Is it going to be left to you in a trust? And that has an impact on your own plan. It has an impact potentially on estate taxes based upon how much you might be receiving. So it's very simple. Blame us, blame the attorney. Feel free to do that. That it came up in the conversation around your own estate planning, or if you don't have a plan in place, it came up for you while you were thinking about your own estate planning and starting to get that done. And it got you wondering about what's going to happen with your parents' plan. So that's a good way to start that conversation. Now, what should you be talking about? Or what should your parents have in place? Let's start with what your parents should have in place. Your parents should have a will. If they have any assets at all, they should have at least a will. And I would argue if they have any assets at all, they should have a trust, because a trust is going to make things easier for everybody in the family. A will is going to require a probate, and assets owned in their own name is going to require a probate, but a trust can help avoid that probate process. So it's really going to make things easy. But at the bare minimum, a will. Here's what happens to our assets when we die, or when I die, and here's who we want to be responsible for managing the distribution of those assets, what we would call the personal representative. So a will, number one. Number two, a healthcare proxy. If your parents become incapacitated, they should have a document in place that says, here's who can step in and make my medical decisions for me if I can't make those decisions for myself. And they may name each other. If both of your parents are living and they're still married, they may name each other as primary decision makers, but you always want to have an alternate decision maker, and very often that will fall to an adult child. So will, healthcare proxy, HIPAA waiver. So most everybody is familiar with the idea of the federal medical privacy law, which says no identifiable medical information about you can be released to anybody but you without your written consent. So a HIPAA waiver kind of smooths the communication if somebody needs to make decisions for your parents. HIPAA waiver basically says the people who make decisions for me should have full access to all of my medical information that might otherwise be protected from disclosure. I would always argue that your parents should have a living will as well, which basically gives guidance about how they would want someone to make end-of-life care decisions. If they're in a persistent vegetative state, should they be kept alive artificially or not? If they're terminal, unconscious, and there is no expectation of their recovering a meaningful quality of life, what should happen next? So that's the healthcare side of things. And in addition to that, they should have what we call a durable power of attorney. And that is a document that says if they're incapacitated, someone would be able to step in and make legal decisions, to sign legal documents, to access financial accounts, to make financial decisions, and to do all of the other kind of day-to-day things that your parents are used to doing for themselves. So those are the three big categories. Will, what happens to their assets? Healthcare proxy, how do medical decisions get made for them if they're incapacitated? And a durable power of attorney, how do legal and financial decisions get made for them if they're incapacitated? You probably also want to be talking with your parents about whether or not they have a plan around their long-term care, depending upon what their asset picture looks like, depending upon what their health is, depending upon what the family history of health is in your family. And if nursing home care is likely to be something that bubbles up in the future or could bubble up in the future, then you want to be having a conversation about how is all of that going to be paid for? Is that going to be paid for out of your parents' resources? Would they otherwise be eligible for Medicaid reimbursement of those nursing home costs? Can they be made eligible for Medicaid? Again, all of this is dependent upon how old your parents are, where they are. You know, when they're in their 60s, that conversation, that long-term care conversation, is not as urgent and as immediate than it would be if they were in their mid-80s. But if they're in their 60s, the ability to plan for that is better than obviously it is when you're in your mid-80s. And the other thing I would add here, because I kind of frame this about not only just talking to your parents, but talking to your family about estate planning, is especially when we're talking about what I would call incapacity documents, healthcare proxy, durable power of attorney, HIPAA waiver. Remember that if you have adult children, they are adult children, and as parents, you can no longer make decisions for them. So, for example, my oldest daughter is 22, college graduate. My youngest daughter, first year in college, coming home on Friday. You know, they've got documents in place so that if something happens to them, my wife or I could step in and make decisions for them, healthcare, legal, or financial. So keep in mind that if you have adult children of your own, that they may need and should probably have their own plan, particularly around incapacity, even if they're not at a point yet where they have assets that would require a will. For those of you who may be watching who have adult children who are starting their own families, same thing. You know, this is a conversation that you can be having with them around the Thanksgiving table. You have kids now. Do you have a plan for who's going to be able to step in and take care of those kids? Our grandchildren, if something happens to you, what does that plan look like? Are we involved? What is our role? Help us to understand it. And keep in mind, as you're having this conversation, you don't need to get into the weeds. Your parents don't need to get into the weeds with you. And they might be uncomfortable about having this conversation because they don't want to get into the weeds with you. You don't necessarily need to know how much you're going to be getting. You don't necessarily need to know how things are going to be divided, where assets are going to go, but you do need to know, is there a plan in place? Am I playing a role in that plan? What is my role? What should I expect? What do we need to do if something happens to you? What do we need to do next? Who do we need to call? So, okay, so forgive me because I forgot to mention this at the outset, but questions. If you have any questions, you can drop them into the chat box. This is where I'm going to lean in and squint a little bit because, you know, this chat box on my computer is small. But there are some questions that are bubbling up here. But if you do have a question, feel free to drop it into the group chat and we can answer those questions. Before we get to the questions, you know, there's more to learn, there's more to know, there's a lot more detail than we're going to get into this morning. If you have questions, feel free to visit our website. There's tons of resources on our website, which is parentsestateplanning.com. There's lots of videos, there's downloadable resources, there are guides you can download, print out, hand to your parents at Thanksgiving. There are things you can direct them to on our website where they can watch lots of videos about all different aspects of estate planning. So our website is a great resource for you. You can also call the office if you would like to have a further conversation about this. You can call our office for yourselves, for your parents. Our office number is 978-263-6900. Just give the office a call and our intake coordinator can walk you through kind of answers to questions and potentially next steps. If you have questions after our pep talk this morning, you can always email them to support@parentsestateplanning.com. Support@parentsestateplanning.com. And we're happy to continue the conversation, answer the questions that come up after. So in the chat box, I'm spending Thanksgiving with my siblings. Any suggestions for questions I should ask them to see who would be good guardian for my daughters? Okay. The conversation, again, not only just about what's happening with your parents' plan, but you could be thinking about your own plan as well. Who could play a role? Because again, everybody's there. When you're, just generally speaking, when you're thinking about guardians for your kids, whether these are questions you're asking your siblings or not, or just things you're thinking about, you want to be thinking first, who would be the person or people who could step in and raise my kids, our kids, as close to the way that I would if I were still there. I think that's the starting point. You should be thinking about people's values and where they live and how old they are and whether they have kids of their own and whether they would be comfortable taking in your kids. You know, if one of your siblings has 5 kids and you've got 4 kids, that might not be the best scenario, but just a factor to consider. When we work with clients in the office, I drill a lot deeper with clients about how to think about this, but just always start from the premise, who would, and with the question, who would be the person who would raise my kids as close to the way that I would if I were still there? And sometimes that has to do with age or family situation or proximity where they live or religion or just values. And that'll help you start to see who might be a really good choice. Next question. My parents think they're all set because they paid for their funeral. What else do they need to do? How can I help them understand that they might need to do more? Planning for their funeral, great first step, but not the only step and certainly not the last step. As I said before, planning for your funeral will make things easier for the family. But what happens to those assets? What happens if you don't die and you're just incapacitated? So again, you want to be having the conversation about, Mom, Dad, I just want to know, have you created a plan for what happens to your stuff if something happens to you? Have you created a plan about who's going to make decisions for you if you become incapacitated? So those are the other things that you want to be talking with your parents about. One more question. My parents planned 12 years ago. Should they have a lawyer take a look at their plan? Do you have any suggestions for how to approach this? Short answer, yes, they should have a lawyer take a look at their plan. A 12-year-old plan is very likely an outdated plan. Here's why: the laws change, families change, assets change, and a lot can change in 12 years. I know the law has changed significantly in the last 12 years. I suspect that your parents' assets have changed somewhat, if not significantly, in the last 12 years, and probably your family has changed. What were once minor children are now adult children. What were once young adult children are now adult children with their own families. And so it's important that the plan keep pace with all of those changes. What I recommend is every 3 years, everyone should be pulling their estate plan out and reviewing it to make sure that it still makes sense, because that's how fast things can change. Sometimes we got to pull them out faster than 3 years because we know things have changed, but at least every 3 years. And that is something that we offer to all of our clients, is the opportunity to come in and sit with us at least every 3 years. But I think at least every 3 years. So if somebody hasn't looked at it in 12, yeah, a lawyer should look at it. And that's something that we would be happy to look at if you wanted to contact our office to have us take a look at your parents' plan. And then we can tell them, okay, here's where things stand right now with that plan. Is that still good? If it is, great. Your 12-year-old plan is still good. But if it's not, then we can shift to how would you rather things go now? And then we can create an updated new plan that reflects current reality. So that looks like that's all the questions that we had for today. Thanks again for joining us. Again, if you want to reach out and get more information, our website, parentsestateplanning.com. You can email the office, support@parentsestateplanning.com. And if you want to give us a call to ask questions directly, or if you want to take some more steps with regard to your own planning or your parents' planning, the office number is 978-263-6900. Our team will be happy to talk to you, take care of you, and show you the next steps so that everybody can have a plan and things can be as easy as possible for everybody. So thank you all again for joining me. I wish you happy, healthy Thanksgiving, and hopefully these conversations go well for you. And again, any questions that bubble up as a result of these conversations, feel free to reach out to us at any time. Take care, everybody. We'll talk to you again next month.